Can you guys see my slides here? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So thank you, and thank you for this invitation. Just a little bit of background on myself. I was an interventional cardiologist at University of Maryland, then private practice in Baltimore. For a lot of reasons, decided practice of medicine wasn't fun anymore. What else can you do with an MD degree that isn't seeing patients? Hopkins in town had a business and medicine program, so I did that over 4 years. And then an opportunity opened up at FDA. So I went there as a medical officer for 6 years in the Office of Device Evaluations, full product life cycle. It could be anything from a couple entrepreneurs with a patent trying to figure out what kind of testing needs to be done up to Medtronic's next drug-coated stent, how designing clinical trials. Since then, I've been in consulting either by myself at Brooks MedTech with a couple of companies, including Sage Growth, Popper, I do market work and reimbursement. NDA Partners, I do my regulatory, and Stepwise is a virtual accelerator. So what I'm going to talk about today is building on what Todd talked about with strategic discovery and what Chad built on, which is the ideation and development process, and how does that relate to regulatory? And then I'll get to a couple slides on the quality control system. So this is a video which is showed around the world in in business schools. This is from South Park, and these are the boys. On the right of the screen is Tweak, whose father owns a coffee shop, so he's a little over-caffeinated. His underwear was being stolen. And so the boys camped out in his room, figured out it was underpants gnomes that were stealing his underwear. They witnessed this, tracked them to their lair, and then asked the chief underpants gnome why they were doing it. And in so doing, got a lecture on the commercialization process. So here's a brief video for you to kind of put all of today's talks into perspective.
I don't get it. You see, phase one, collect underpants. Phase two, phase three, profit. I get it. No, you don't.
So what he's just laid out there is your idea, collecting underpants. And then phase two, we'll just kind of figure it out as we go. And phase three, profit. And naturally, you can go from collecting underpants to profit. And that is kind of the entrepreneur's dilemma. And since we've gotten a lot of ideas on this, I'm going to skim through my next two slides. But you know, as a medical device developer, it's really important to do as Todd said, understand what you're trying to accomplish, how you're going to do it, and think all the way to the end for this product. You know, what are the key opinion leaders going to think of your product and your solution? Will physicians accept it? How can you get paid? Maybe there's no reimbursement. That's another challenge. How will you maintain sales and cash flow as you develop and iterate your process? The regulatory piece, FDA, CE mark for Europe, Japan. Design, manufacturing, quality. You've heard today about some of the prototyping and development process where you need to think about, do different design features have different complexity that may lead to challenges in manufacturing or cost? Complexity leads to, you know, potential breakdowns and risk in design failure. And does that have medical or regulatory complications associated with it? And then your investors, again, you're going to need to keep the funds coming in until you're generating cash and to keep moving forward. Another thing to keep in mind, if you're developing an iPhone competitor or a new potato chip, you kind of know intuitively what your market is. In medicine, it can be very complex. Are you developing something that could go directly to patients, directly to providers, so the physicians? Are you selling to hospitals, private payers, CMS? Are your targets older than 65 and they're going to have to pay for it? Are you making part of a piece that's used in conjunction with one or two manufacturers, devices, or products? And so your only acquirer or your only tool for sales is through that co-development partner. Are you developing something that's going to be used by industry or a non-government organization? So again, you have to think about this. There may be multiple uses for your widget. And as you're going to target and do your ideation and doing your discovery, you need to think about the market you're going to try and attack and develop your product from the earliest stages to get there. So that's kind of a segue into the regulatory piece. And a lot of people think of FDA as just, you know, another box to be checked along the way. And in fact, it can be and should be part of your early strategy piece. So you need to remember the claims you're going to get for your product come through the testing that you do and therefore what goes into your label. You can only, FDA will scrutinize everything that's in your label. You've got to prove it with data. It could be from bench testing, animal testing, clinical testing, but that's all you're going to be able to say when you go to the market. So you need to think about the testing you're going to do and what you can accomplish. So you've got to show that it's safe, got to show it's effective, and then again, your marketing and your reimbursement has to come from who's your customer, and how are you going to get paid. So this is a highly simplified slide of a very complicated process, and shows kind of the regulatory process. Devices, medical devices are broken down by class 1, 2, and 3. 1 is the lowest risk, things like scalpels, hollow bore catheter perhaps, tongue depressor. Class 3 are permanent implants, highest risk, a heart assist device, an implanted hip, a laser for complex surgery, and class 2 is everything in between. And all these, depending on the complexity of the product and the risk associated with it, or the risk of the target population. So a healthy population, the same product in that versus perhaps an immunocompromised or maybe a hemodialysis patient population, very different risk level, very different testing. To give an example of this, I worked with a bunch of really clever docs at a university who had realized that you've probably seen in your legs, puffiness, a buildup of fluid. That can be called lymphedema. And the common final pathway of getting a lot of this fluid back into the body is through the lymphatic duct, which is up under your arm, going back into the veins up there. So typically, in most people, it's very small. But in folks that have a ton of fluid in their legs that need to get back, it can get dilated as large as your thumb, and then it becomes a stricture. So these docs had a great idea. They were going to make something like drain that fluid out. And they hadn't really thought about how they were going to do this. They thought, well, we're going to take that fluid, we're going to drain it and pump it back into the body, and we're going to plant that entire system, under the skin, and we're going to power it. So that sounds like a really great idea, but they hadn't really thought about what happens if you drain that fluid out. So technological approaches for this, if you just drain it to a bag by gravity, that's a class 1. Class 1, you sign up, it's like paying your taxes, 48 hours, $5,000, you can sell it in 48 hours. Now, if you're draining it and you're sucking it out with a gravity suction, that's a little higher risk. If you have an active pump, that's a class 2. Now you could dehydrate this patient if you pump it too fast. Now, if you want to put it back in, where do you put it into the body? Do you let it go by gravity? That may again be low. That's probably a class 1 or a class 2, depending on what technology you use. If you're actively pumping it, that's definitely a class 2. And if you've got an auto feedback so that there's minimal physician oversight of this, that could be a class 3. Now, if you take that entire system and you implant it, and you've got to get energy to it. It could be like a Samsung phone and those batteries could blow up in your belly. That's obviously a problem. That's a class 3. So those physicians had thought of a really important problem, and solutions to try and attack that problem had very different regulatory as well as engineering hurdles associated with it. So it's really important to think about it. And even more important to think of is, you can start simple and get more complex as time goes on. And you want to think of your product development and your regulatory as more of a spiral of development. Development is rarely a ladder, and you can keep iterating and improving, doing more studies, more bench testing, iterating your design, changing your materials, and using FDA as multiple steps. And each time you get a clearance for a class 2 and broaden your indications, those are major milestones that may bring in more investor money or more revenue because you've expanded your markets or differentiated your product. So it's really important to think about this from a design stage. And when you're working with Route 3 and doing your prototyping, you need to have the end in mind. Okay, we're gonna hit that low. What is the minimum viable product that we can do and sell and will be needed and will solve this need in the marketplace? And what is the regulatory burden associated with that compared to perhaps a more complex version or a more specific version that's going to target a different population. So think about iterations on your strategy early on and build that in. So the next thing I want to talk about is the pre-submission process. And early on, especially when maybe you're doing your first prototypes or you're testing your prototypes, Used to be called the Pre-IDE, now it's called a pre-submission. It's essentially free consulting from FDA. You wrap up everything that you've got in terms of background, and I've seen everything from 100-page, super in-depth document to, just a patent with a couple questions on the bottom. So you wrap up all your background questions, your background information, you ask questions, FDA. We believe that this is a class 2 product, do you agree? We believe that the indication could be this treatment of lymphedema in the legs by drainage to gravity. Do you agree that that is reasonable? We believe that the testing we need to do is these 10 bench tests. Do you agree? We believe we need no animal testing. Do you agree? Yes, no. Or here's what our clinical trial is going to look like. Give us some feedback. So you submit it to FDA. In 75 to 90 days, you get used to be a face-to-face. Now with COVID, you get a video meeting or a telephone call, and they will answer your questions in writing, and then you can go back and forth. As opposed to the drug world where these are really rationed and you get one at each stage of development, you can have 1,000 of these meetings if you want. The cost is 3 months' time, and the cost of the effort of preparation and perhaps getting someone to help you. Again, I could do my own taxes, God help, my family, but if I went to H&R Block, I would be more successful with my taxes. So the better questions you ask, the more actionable answers you'll get. But at the end of these meetings, you should know how to go through the next step, and you've gotten feedback on your testing, your design. So if you take nothing away from this other than go and look at South Park because it's hilarious, pre-submissions are good, and you should go early and talk to them often and really validate your process. So the other thing that we talked about, and Chad started talking about this, is your quality system management. And this is really important. So a quality system is a system that is kind of binds all your business processes to do with documentation and development, sourcing, and then the CAPA process, the review process, the vetting process. So it begins with a quality management system. You have policies. How do you organize it? How is your management structure? Number 2, your management responsibility here. These are standard operating procedures. How do you approach different things? There are industry guidelines. There are international standards, ISO standards, that may guide you. FDA may have their own standards. CE mark may apply to different standards. So you have to know where you want to go in terms of market, Japan, Europe, Australia, US, and know what standards you're going to be held to, and make sure that internally and also with your process development that you are upholding these. So it also applies to resource management, including personnel issues, equipment that you have, equipment that you need for your manufacturing, how you maintain them, where they are, where your facilities are. The product realization. So again, the prototyping process, the manufacturing process, are using proper design controls, production, purchasing. Are you how do you handle your suppliers? How do you document that your suppliers are meeting the standards that you need them to be built at, and your design tolerances, and then of course to meet your customer needs. And then measurement analysis, you have to have quality control. You have to document in medical devices that you've got quality control and you're meeting your specs, and your products are not going to fail, break, injure people. When they do, you need to have a process in place to track it, understand what the process was, track it all the way back to sourcing of your materials and manufacturing, and understand what went wrong so that you can fix that process. So that is the quality management program. And a document control system really is how do you document all this? And there are software programs that you can buy, everything from really easy manual putting things in box, or another online source, up to really extravagant ones that can be over $100,000, and everything in between when you start and get into some of the different bells and whistles. But this keeps all of your policies, your standard operating procedures, all of your documentation, your source materials, your standards, your guidances, all of that, it keeps in a record, and you can start to do this. So one of the big questions would be, when do you need to start thinking about this? The earlier the better. If you're struggling for startup, your best, and you've got $100,000 from a TEDCO grant, the best use of your money really is, prototyping and testing. but you need to be thinking about these things. And prototyping firms, engineering firms such as Route 3 are building and documenting as they go, and they're going to hand over, you know, the quality materials and documentations that you'll need, and you can put that into your current system, and as you grow, they'll build and your requirements will go up. So that's, you know, in 10, 12 minutes, kind of an approach to regulatory. There's, I mean, you could talk for days on all this stuff, but think about this when you're, you know, strategy early, a lot of heavy thought before you start manufacturing and going after your market and your design. Think about how you're going to get from underpants to profit, intentional product development, thinking about the cycles of product and data development, getting more sophisticated as you go. And the FDA, you know, can really be a great resource. That should have been the fourth bullet here. Think about approaching them early and validating what you're doing. They have experience from clients that have come in and used the same materials, the same design features, and have faced the same problems. And while they may not be able to tell you specifically, they can let you know what's going to be a problem and what's not going to be a problem. And they can be a great resource for you. So thank you. I'll hand it back over and we can talk more in questions if there are questions about this.
Yeah, that was great. That was a lot of information. That's really good. So